You've spent your entire life standing on solid ground, believing that the line on a map separating your country from the next one is somehow real, drawn into the earth itself. Every argument you've ever had about borders, every flag you've stood beside, every conflict fought over a few miles of dirt, all of it assumes those lines actually exist. Then, for a very small number of humans, something happens that erases that belief in seconds. They leave the planet, they turn around, and they look back. What happens to the human mind in that exact moment has a name, and it has been quietly reshaping the way astronauts see the rest of their lives ever since. In 1987, a space philosopher named Frank White published a book describing something he had noticed while interviewing astronaut after astronaut. He called it the overview effect, and the idea actually came to him years earlier. On a completely ordinary commercial flight, staring out the window as the ground scrolled by underneath him, he realized that if you lived somewhere permanently high above the Earth, you would always have an overview, a single, unbroken, whole view of the planet you came from. Astronauts who actually experienced it described something far bigger than a nice view. They described borders disappearing, nations blurring into a single, fragile blue and white sphere hanging in absolute blackness, with no visible edges separating one group of humans from another. By the time White published the 4th edition of his book in 2019, he had gathered original interviews with 31 astronauts, pilots, scientists, and engineers from wildly different backgrounds and different countries, and their accounts lined up with a consistency that surprised even him. Even before White gave the feeling a name, the very first human to leave the atmosphere seemed to sense something close to it. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first person in space, and in his own accounts of that flight, he described being struck by how strikingly blue and fragile the planet looked from orbit. A small, glowing world with no visible lines dividing it at all. This wasn't a completely new idea out of nowhere. Back in 1948, decades before anyone had left Earth's atmosphere, the astronomer Fred Hoyle predicted that the day a photograph of Earth taken from outside existed, a new idea as powerful as anything in history would be set loose in the world. He turned out to be right earlier than almost anyone expected. In December 1968, the crew of Apollo 8 became the first humans to see Earth rise over the lunar horizon, and astronaut William Anders captured it in a single photograph now known simply as Earthrise. That image is widely credited as one of the sparks behind the modern environmental movement, arriving right before the first Earth Day was held in 1970. A picture, taken almost by accident on a mission built to explore the moon, ended up changing how an entire planet thought about the fragile object it was standing on. One of the most striking personal accounts comes from Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell, the 6th human being to walk on the moon. On the flight home, staring out the spacecraft window at Earth, he described a sudden overwhelming sense that everything in the universe was somehow connected. The feeling was intense enough that, after leaving NASA, he spent the rest of his life studying human consciousness. It wasn't the moonwalk that changed him. It was 15 quiet minutes looking out a window on the way back. So, what is actually happening inside an astronaut's brain during this shift? Researchers, including psychologist David Yadin, have studied the overview effect as part of a broader category called self-transcendent experiences, moments where the boundary of the self seems to dissolve, and a person feels connected to something enormously larger than themselves. This overlaps with decades of research into awe, led by psychologists like Dr. Keltner, who has shown that experiences of true vastness can shrink a person's sense of self almost instantly. Under a strong dose of awe, people become measurably more generous, more cooperative, and less focused on their own individual concerns, at least for a while. Some research has even linked frequent experiences of awe to lower levels of stress hormones and reduced markers of inflammation in the body, as if the emotion doesn't just change how you think, it changes your physiology too. Astronauts appear to experience an extreme concentrated version of exactly that effect, delivered all at once, roughly 250 miles above the Earth's surface. Not every astronaut describes it the same way. Yadin's research also found that culture shapes how the experience gets interpreted. Some astronauts describe it in explicitly religious terms, others in vaguely spiritual language. Others describe it simply as an overwhelming sense of duty toward the planet they can now see as a whole. But underneath the different words, nearly all of them describe the same underlying shift, a jump from thinking about their own country, their own mission, their own career, to thinking about the Earth as one single undivided thing that all of humanity happens to share. Former NASA astronaut Bob Behnken put it simply after his own flight, explaining how seeing Earth's single shared atmosphere from orbit reframed how he thought about facing global challenges together, rather than as separate competing nations. Not every account is purely peaceful either. Some astronauts have described an initial wave of vertigo, or even genuine fear, a sudden sense of insignificance before it settles into something closer to belonging. The shift isn't always instant or gentle, but nearly everyone who goes through it describes coming out the other side fundamentally rearranged. This isn't ancient history either. In 2026, the Artemis 2 crew flew past the moon, and once again, scientists documented the same shift beginning to unfold in real time. Astronauts reporting a growing awareness of Earth's fragility as it shrank behind them into a small, precious dot. Nearly 60 years after Apollo 8, the effect is still firing in a new generation, on a new mission, exactly as Frank White predicted it would. Here's the part that actually matters for you, because you are probably never going to space. You don't need a rocket to trigger a smaller version of this same neurological shift. Keltner's research on awe found that people get measurable versions of the same effect, from standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon, walking beneath towering redwood trees, or simply lying on their back under a truly dark, star-filled sky, far away from city lights. The mechanism appears to be the same one astronauts experience, just delivered at a smaller dose. Your sense of self quietly shrinking in the presence of something vast enough that your usual worries stop fitting inside your field of view. One study following older adults over several weeks found that something as simple as taking regular outdoor awe walks deliberately aimed at noticing something vast or unexpected, meaningfully reduced daily distress and increased positive emotion, compared to ordinary walks covering the exact same distance. The astronauts didn't discover a special technique. They simply had access to a view most of us will never get. You don't need their view, you just need to go looking on purpose for something vast enough to shrink your own worries back down to size. So the next time you feel impossibly small in front of something enormous, an ocean, a mountain range, a night sky without a single visible city light, don't rush to feel insignificant. That shrinking feeling is not your mind failing you. It is the exact same mechanism that turns hardened test pilots and engineers into people who come home from orbit, talking about unity, fragility, and how absurd every border on Earth looked from 250 miles up. You just need to find your own version of the window and let yourself look out of it for long enough to actually see what's really out there.